I would like to start today by reading from a passage in the Bible it comes really, some people have said it comes from one of the greatest sermons ever preached. Matthew 5, 6, and 7 contains Jesus' great Sermon on the Mount. And we're going to look at a section from that sermon. It's found in Matthew chapter 5, starting with verse 21, where Jesus makes this statement. He said, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder. Of course, what he's referring to is the 10 Commandments. That's one of the 10 Commandments. You shall not murder. And anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. You see that in Exodus, in Numbers, and in Deuteronomy. So murder is a pretty big deal. And Jesus said, you shall not murder. But then he goes a step further in verse 22. He says, but I tell you. Now, I'm going to highlight this for just a second. In the Greek language, it actually literally reads ego de lego. Okay? If I want to say, I tell you something or I say something to you, all I have to say is lego. The O is the first person pronoun, I. So leg is to say or to tell. I tell you lego. But Jesus doesn't just say it that way. He says, ego de lego. And of course we get the English word ego from this word. This is the first person pronoun if you just want to bring it out by itself. So in this section, what Jesus is saying, he said, you've heard that it was said, you shall not murder. But I, and this is like he was making it in bold print, underline, underline, underline. But I've got something else to tell you, something really important to tell you, that anyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Now let that soak in for just a second. Jesus said it's wrong to murder. So there's a line out there that you cross when you murder. But he says, I'm telling you that I want you to deal with the anger in you before you even get close to murdering. That needs to be addressed in a person's life. And then he goes on to another statement and he says, again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, rakah, which is kind of an ancient Israelite way of mocking somebody, putting them down. This is a kind of a derisive term. If anyone says rakah, they're going to be answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. So it's not just your anger, but it's how your anger sometimes leads you to belittle people or to put them down or to say things about them. He said, I want you to think about that. And then he said, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar in reference to the temple, and there you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, I want you to leave your gift there in front of that altar. You first go and be reconciled to them, and then come and offer your gift. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Lord, I pray that you'll take this important passage from the Bible and use it today to speak to us about something that's really important in our lives. Help us, Lord, to hear your voice, your word. In Jesus' name, amen. On April the 20th, 1999, these two men, young men, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, walked into the Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. They were wearing long trench coats, long black trench coats. Under the trench coat of at least one of the boys was a t-shirt they were wearing that said wrath on it. They were coming to execute wrath on some people in their high school. They would kill 13 people that day, mostly fellow students, one teacher. 24 other people would be injured by their shooting. Eventually, they would turn the guns on themselves and take their own lives. And at that time, in 1999, that was the most deadly school shooting in American history. And I remember that day. I clearly remember when that happened on that day. Kind of like 9/11. I remember where I was when I first heard about this tragedy at Columbine High School. And this incident was so shocking. It was culture shocking to the system of Americans. that it generated a lot of chaos and outrage. Questions were asked. How could something like this happen? Where were the parents? Where was Harris and Klebold's parents? Why didn't they know what was going on? Why didn't the police respond sooner? Everybody was looking for somebody to point fingers at and blame. And the days were filled with strong emotion following this. I read a story about even a church. There was a church who hosted the funeral service for one of the perpetrators. And the fact that they would do this created such controversy, such an emotional response, that it split the church. The senior pastor ends up resigning from the church. And people with long-standing relationships were angry, outraged with one another. These were tough times. There's a guy named Dave Cullen who's written a book about this massacre. And in the book, he says some things I think are important. He says 7 days after the massacre, shortly before sunrise, a row of 15 wooden crosses rose up along the crest of the hill near the school. Now, I've highlighted 15 wooden crosses because if you were paying attention when I spoke earlier, I said that Klebold and Harris killed 13 people. There are 15 crosses because there was initially on that hill a cross for Klebold and a cross for Eric Harris as well. They stood 7 feet high, these crosses, 3 feet wide, and they were spaced evenly along the length of the mesa. Over the next 5 days, 125,000 people trekked up the hill to reach the crosses. Many waited 2 hours in the rain just to begin the climb. It felt like a pilgrimage. Here are some actual photographs of those crosses on that mesa next to the school. You can see they became like memorials. On 13 crosses, the messages were loving and uncontroversial. And you can imagine what's going on here. The killer's crosses hosted a bitter debate. People wrote notes like, "Hate breeds hate," and "How can anyone forgive you?" Saturday night's edition of the Rocky Mountain News led with a 3-word headline: "Dad destroys crosses." Now, not all of them. A haunting photo captured 13 remaining tributes with 2 stark gaps. The perpetrator's crosses had lasted 3 days before this one dad felt like they needed to come down. In fact, he had something to say about it. This is what one dad said. He said, "You don't cheapen what Christ did for us by honoring murderers with crosses." We could probably spend some time just talking about that statement and the implications of that statement. But here's what I want to say today. I think if there's a moral to this story, the moral to this story of the Columbine tragedy is that anger has the power to destroy. This story of the Columbine massacre is a story that's bathed in an atmosphere of anger. There's anger in the hearts of the 2 perpetrators. These were 2 angry young men when they did this. It stimulated anger throughout the community, even anger in some of the churches afterward. One thing's abundantly clear: anger has the power to destroy. Now that happened pretty close to 26 years ago. Okay. Here's a question to ponder. Do you think we've gotten better with our anger in America since Columbine? What do you think? Well, since Columbine, there have been 118 active shooter incidents in U.S. schools, K through 12. 440 people have died. 1,243 people have been injured. What this means is there's just still in America a lot of anger. But maybe you could say it's worse today than what it was back then. In fact, in a recent poll that I came across, said 84% of Americans think our country is angrier than we were a generation ago. And they even admit 42% say, "Hey, I'm angrier." than what I used to be? What about on the highways? You know, it used to be when you drive down a street in your community and you saw somebody, maybe they were doing something wrong with their car, you'd honk at them. Nowadays, we're a little bit afraid to honk at people because of road rage. Road rage shootings are up 449% between 2014 and 2023. 3,095 people have been killed in America or shot in America from road rage shootings in that 10-year period. I was reading one anger researcher who was talking about the mood in America today. Her name's Laura Beth Moss. And she said, what's scary about our culture right now is that we're kind of getting addicted to divisiveness. It's becoming part of our identity. And she's talking about what you see in chat rooms online. She's talking about what you see in social media, posts that people make. So people are just becoming increasingly mean to one another, put downs, verbal attacks, provocative statements, pushing buttons. Last fall was pretty divisive in our country leading up to the election. And you'd have thought, it'll get better once we get past the election. Is it better? I still see put downs, verbal attacks, provocative statements, pushing buttons. I think what we're seeing today is we live in a culture that's increasingly addicted to and even more deeply influenced by anger than perhaps we want to admit. What about you? Now, if I'm going to be honest today in talking about anger, when the Bible talks about anger, it doesn't say that anger is always and only evil or bad. In fact, the Bible talks about righteous anger and unrighteous anger. For example, under righteous anger in the book of Ephesians, Paul's letter to the Ephesians, chapter 4, verse 26, he says, be angry and do not sin. In other words, what Paul's admitting is it is possible to have a version of anger that is not sinful anger. In fact, it's almost as if he's saying there are times we ought to be angry about certain things, but not sinful anger. You remember Jesus cleansed the money changers from the Jewish temple with righteous anger. I think we all know that sometimes good things can be accomplished with righteous anger. Back in 1979, there was a young man named Marcus Brown. He was 18 years old and he was killed by a drunk driver. And his mother, Becky Brown, started a movement, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. She channeled her grief and her anger and accomplished something good. Now, maybe it'd be great if I could spend a whole chunk of this sermon on righteous anger, but there's not enough time in the scope of this message to focus any more on righteous anger. I think that it is a possibility, and there are aspects of it that we should be alert to, and probably most all of us think that our anger is always righteous, even if it isn't. But we're in the middle of a sermon series on the 7 deadly sins. We've looked at these 4 over the past 4 weeks, and today we're looking at this one. So today we're going to focus on the fact that many times our anger or wrath is not righteous, but rather unrighteous. And I want to make what I think is an important point next about this. I think it's a similar point that I made last week about envy. And that is that as I said, that envy and jealousy and covetousness is many times a second sin or a second emotion. In the same way, anger and wrath are always second emotions, okay? And before you have an experience of anger or wrath, there's always either a hurt or a frustration or a fear. That's the first emotion. So something happens. Somebody hurts me. Somebody does something to me. And I lose something because they've hurt me and it makes me angry. Or maybe somebody's just downright annoying and frustrating the fire out of me. And I've listened to them yap the way they yap for one time too many. And finally I explode with anger because I'm frustrated at how they're living their life or what they're doing. Or sometimes I can become so afraid of something that I explode with anger. I lash out in anger, kind of as a self-protective mechanism. You see, there may be some of you who are listening to this message today, and the truth of the matter is you have a problem with anger, and you know who you are, you know? And if you really want to understand your problem with anger, one of the first things I want to suggest to you is figure out what your first emotion is. Why are you angry? Why do you have these feelings? Begin to explore the root cause of your anger if you want to really find a way to begin to deal with your problem of anger. And also, kind of like last week, I suggested that envy, jealousy, and covetousness are three words that we use almost interchangeably in our culture. You know, they're kind of synonyms with each other. Well, the same thing could be said about anger and wrath. Sometimes we use these words interchangeably. But I want to suggest to you today that there is a technical difference between them. And kind of like with jealousy and envy and covetousness, sometimes it's hard to read and to ascertain the differences. Sometimes it's that way with these two words, but here's how I see the differences. Anger is sort of like a basic emotion, okay? It's an intense emotional state that's induced by some displeasure, rooted in a hurt, a disappointment, or a fear, okay? It's a basic reaction. Wrath, though, is a stronger reaction. It's more extreme. It's maybe even more extensive. And with wrath, it becomes harmful to others. Now today, I'm not talking about God's wrath, okay? God's wrath is different. God's wrath is always righteous. Today, we're talking about human wrath, and it ain't always righteous, okay? When I've moved from anger to wrath, I'm feeling something more strongly, and I'm going to start hurting people. It might be verbally through screams or slanders or gossips or whatever, or it might even become something physical. Anger grows to wrath whenever we're starting to hurt other people. And many times, as a third component to wrath, there's this sense of vengeance. And a lot of times wrapped up in that is justification. You know, what I'm doing is right. My anger is justified is what we'll tend to think, whether it really is or isn't. Okay. So it's more extensive. It's got more tentacles coming out from it than just anger. So let's look back at the story in Genesis chapter 4 of Cain and Abel. You remember Cain was hurt and disappointed that his offering that he brought to God was not accepted. And his disappointment turned to envy of his brother whose offering and sacrifice was accepted. God confronts him about this. And he says, look, sin is crouching at your door and it's going to eat you alive if you don't deal with it. Well, he doesn't deal with it and he becomes more angry and his anger turns to wrath and he takes his brother's life. You see this also in the story of Joseph and his brothers. The favoritism that Jacob showed towards Joseph. It ate up the other brothers, They envied that Joseph was favored. They envied that Joseph got special gifts that they didn't receive from their dad. And the envy turned to anger, and the anger turned to hatred, and the hatred, turned to wrath. They punished. They wanted to kill him. Some of them wanted to kill him. But eventually they sold him to some Midianite traders traveling to Egypt. I have shared in several of these sermons in the series, statements or comments made by Thomas Aquinas, the ancient Catholic theologian. And he's written a lot about the 7 deadly sins. And he's written about wrath as well. And I found it interesting in reading some of his thoughts about wrath, is that he says wrath has daughters. I don't know why he didn't say sons. Because wrath, they're the daughters of wrath. There's offspring. They're components. They're avenues and angles to wrath. He says, he describes wrath's daughters as verbal and or physical attacks. Now, I'm not using his language. I'm taking his wordage, his verbiage, and kind of just modernizing it. So there's verbal and physical attacks rooted in extreme emotions. And really, when you say verbal attacks, it could be insulting speech. You said you frequently see that. Belittling or dehumanizing, hateful twisting of the truth. And when there's wrath involved, there's this obsession with revenge. I'm right and you're wrong and you deserve to be punished. A lot of times when we feel wrathful, we feel like the other person needs to pay a price, Now, I say all that to take us now back to this great passage in Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus talks about anger. And he says, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago." God spoke to Moses, gave him the 10 commandments. And one of the 10 commandments said, "You shall not murder." And then if you read in other parts of Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, you'll see that anyone who murders will be subject to punishments, judgments. Murder is a line that God doesn't want us to cross in our relationships with people. But Jesus takes this commandment and he goes deeper. He looks into the inside of our hearts and he says, "I tell you that anyone who is in fact angry with a brother or sister, that's going to lead you, that will make you subject to judgment in ways similar to murder." So murder is wrong, but there's also, Jesus said, I'm concerned with your heart. The 7 deadly sins are sins of the heart. And Jesus is getting us to look inside of ourselves. In fact, he goes on to say, there's language that we use to talk about people. There's ways in which we mock people. There's language when we're angry about somebody who thinks differently or has done something we feel like it justifies name calling. And Jesus said, I want you to think about how that when you get angry at somebody, you feel justified in cursing them and pulling them down with provocative names that you or labels that you throw on them. Jesus said, look at all of that. Be careful about all of that. This is kind of what Thomas Aquinas was getting at, whenever he's talking about verbal insults, verbal belittling and dehumanizing, or hateful twisting of the truth. Aquinas was getting us to think about how when we're angry at somebody, we'll use language and we'll even twist the story. We'll make them look worse than what they really are, And then there's these final 2 verses that I want to zero in on to kind of close with this message today. Jesus sets up a scenario. He says, let's imagine that you're in the temple in Jerusalem and you're offering your gift at the altar. Maybe it's even a sin offering. Maybe it's just something big. You brought an animal. You've waited in line for your time to offer this sacrifice to God. And while you're waiting in line, you remember that your brother or sister has something against you. And what he means by that is you remember, I treated so-and-so kind of rotten this last week and I've sinned against them. So they've got something against you because you have sinned against them. And notice what he says. Leave your gift there. Drop that critter. Drop that animal. Get out of line. Right? If you're right, maybe you're next in front of the altar. And you remember, I sinned against them. And I've not apologized. I've not confessed my sin. He says, I want you to go and be reconciled to that brother or sister. Then you come back and offer your gift to God. You see, implied in this teaching of Jesus is that when you realize that you've sinned against somebody, you need to own it. You need to apologize. You need to seek to heal that relationship. And this is on you. It's your responsibility. You realize what you've done. You go and take care of this, you know. There's a temptation that whenever we're angry at somebody and we've said things to them, there's a temptation for us sometimes to feel justified in our anger. And in our anger, we won't confess. We won't apologize. I'm right and they're wrong, or I'm right because they messed up, you know. Jesus tells us to go and take care of these sins. I think the thing that fascinates me about this is that Jesus values reconciliation over worship. Jesus values reconciliation over sacrifices. It's sort of like you're at church and you realize that you've sinned against somebody. Get up out of church right now. But we're only on the first song. Get up out of church right now. You go and you reconcile to that person. Then you come back and do the worship service. Jesus values reconciliation, which implies these kinds of things, over you just going to church and trying to ignore and act like it didn't happen. This is a pretty powerful teaching of Jesus to deal with our anger. Let's pray. Lord, I pray today that you'll take this really magnificent passage in the Bible and use it to speak to us. Give us ears to hear what your Spirit wants to say to me if there's a situation that I need to deal with in my life.